Only 2.5 hours after their last seen, they're reported missing. So it's like they were moving fast. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, please do subscribe, and if you're old here, hello again. My name's Kate Philpott and I cover true crime and missing person cases on my channel. Little change of scenery today. I am living in Spain for the month of April, if you didn't see my previous post. Luckily I have some cute plants and all. So today's case is one that I actually had never heard of before, and the only reason I even heard of it at all is because I got this comment on my recent community post and I was like, okay, what's this about? Found all of these details about it being unsolved and a double murder, and I was just like, hang on, I cannot be the only person who hasn't heard about this case. Maybe I am the only person, I don't know. But if I haven't heard about it, there are definitely people out there who haven't either. And it's unsolved, so the more information we can spread, the better. Before we jump in, make sure you're following on TikTok and Instagram at KatePhilpott_YT. But let's get into this case. This is the unsolved case of Lyric Cook-Morrissey and Elizabeth Collins. So this case takes place in 2012 in a small town called Evansdale in Iowa. And yes, this was one of those close-knit communities where pretty much everyone knew everyone. I think the population at the time of this crime was around 4,500 people, so very, very small. And the whole town was like 4 miles from one end to the other. But let's talk a little bit about the girls themselves. Lyric was born on the 2nd of October 2001, and that meant she was 10 at the time of her initial disappearance. She loved One Direction, she loved painting her nails different colours, and one of her favourite things to do was go and play outside with her cousin Elizabeth, who was a little bit younger. She was born on the 31st of July 2003, so she was 8 years old at the time. And Elizabeth was bubbly, she was so full of life, so chatty, she loved exploring new places and also snuggling up on the couch with her family and some popcorn. And actually at the time of her disappearance, which was in July 2012, her and her mother were planning out her 9th birthday party, which would have been happening at the end of the month. They were talking about doing a Hawaiian theme and getting a multi-tiered chocolate cake with like mermaids and goldfish, and it sounds so extra but so incredibly magical for a 9-year-old's birthday party. And the thing about Elizabeth was she was always the last one to finish her meals because she was just so busy talking. Alright, before we get into the disappearance of the girls, there's one or two things I just want to say about the lead up to the disappearance. Only days before the girls disappeared, Lyric had actually tried to run away because her home life just wasn't ideal. Her parents were fairly active in the DRUG world, and there's a lot that comes with that. And both of them were in and out of prison for, honestly, Lyric's entire childhood. So I can only imagine that must have been really, really difficult for her. But she did have her little cousin Elizabeth, who was honestly like a sister to her. The girls were so close. But the thing was, Elizabeth had no reason to run away. Elizabeth was so happy. Her little family unit was like completely healthy. There was nothing abnormal. So let's get into the actual disappearance then. All right, so this was Friday the 13th of July 2012. The girls spent the morning at Elizabeth's house before being dropped to their grandmother's house, and her name was Wilma. Sometime around 11:30 a.m. the girls decided to go out for a bike ride. They loved cycling their bikes every day. As far as I'm aware, they were going out cycling their bikes like almost every day that summer. As far as their relatives and guardians knew, they generally wouldn't go that far. But let's be honest, they were kids. If the eyes were off them for a few minutes, they could well have gone much further. On this particular day, the girls were expected to come home sometime between 12 and 1 p.m. But the girls never came home from this bike ride. They were seen riding down Broven Boulevard at 12:23 p.m. and they were also spotted around 1.5 miles from Wilma's house in the area near Myers Lake. This was before being seen on Lake Avenue, still together and still on their bikes. And it really didn't take long for their families to get concerned because they really weren't expected to be out long. And Misty, Lyric's mother, actually showed up to collect the girls sometime around lunchtime, and the girls definitely should have been home by that point, but they weren't. They all looked around the immediate roads and they couldn't see any sign of them, so they started calling family and friends, but nobody had seen them. Pretty quickly, this became a serious cause for concern. Only 2.5 hours after the initial bike ride began, Lyric and Elizabeth were both reported missing. Which I will say is kind of amazing, because how often does that happen? Like, only 2.5 hours after their last seen, they're reported missing. So it's like they were moving fast. Pretty soon, the searches began and everyone in the community wanted to help from the get-go. And then the Black Hawk Sheriff's Department and the local fire department also joined in the search. Now later that day, on the same day, they did find something. On the biking trail along Myers Lake, Lyric and Elizabeth's bikes were found. Not only that, about 20 feet from the bikes, over the fence that separated the biking trail from the lake, Elizabeth's bag and mobile phone were found, which is a little concerning. Yes, kids can be irresponsible. They can leave their bike in a random place and then just forget that they even have to care about it, but it just was giving off sketchy vibes from the beginning. It did lead a lot of people to think, though, that the girls decided to get into the lake. This was a hot summer's day, maybe they just wanted to cool down. But then there was another school of thought where it was like, yes, but wouldn't we find their shoes? Surely if they were going to get into the lake, they would have at least taken off their shoes. Now, a man called Ted, who would frequent this cycling trail, he actually came forward and said that he saw the bikes around 12:30 that day. He actually had to swerve around the bikes because they were just abandoned in the middle of the bike trail, which, if the sighting from 12:23 p.m. is spot on, then that only leaves like a 7-minute window for something to have gone wrong, which is very, very tight. Who knows how close this guy Ted was to actually witnessing something, and maybe what later happened wouldn't have had to happen. I know I shouldn't go down that way of thinking, but I can't help myself. With all that said though, by the next morning, the FBI had even joined in the search, and the area surrounding the lake as well as the lake itself was thoroughly searched. They brought in divers, they brought in search dogs, and they also started interviewing local offenders and conducting polygraph tests to apply some pressure to the people who could have some information or possibly even be responsible for what happened to the girls. Unfortunately though, absolutely nothing came of this. But the community as a whole was so strong. They held hope so strongly, so firmly for so long, for months honestly. But a week after the girls went missing, the search of Myers Lake was called off, and investigators were 100% sure at this point that the girls were not in there because they had drained so much of it. They had brought in divers for the parts that they couldn't drain. Like, there really was nothing left in that area for them to search, and as a result, this case was now considered an abduction. Now, before we move on with the investigation and everything, I do just want to go a little bit more into Lyric's parents and their background, just because it sets the scene a little bit more. It just gives us a bit more information. So Lyric's mother was called Misty and her father was called Dan. Misty and Dan were no longer together, and they both had separate, pretty intense criminal histories. Unfortunately, because of their past and because of the kind of groups and social circles they had been in, they got a lot of heat from all of society, honestly. So Misty, on one hand, Lyric's mother, she had been in and out of prison for multiple DRUG charges, alcohol charges, conspiracy to manufacture and distribute METH. She was apparently a key member of an METH ring. But honestly, by the time the girls disappeared, she was actually really getting her act together. She was clean. She was 2 months out of a halfway house. I believe she'd gotten a job, and like, things were steady, things were stable. And Misty speaks out openly about this whole period of her life because she's like, yeah, like, I can't hide that. I have a criminal history. I have a history with DRUGS. She's not trying to deny it for a second, which I respect so much. She also let her previous colleagues, if you will, know that she had told the police about their interactions together. The police had no interest in them related to DRUGS. It was simply just they needed to find out who was responsible for the abductions of Lyric and Elizabeth. Dan, then, on the other hand, Lyric's father, he had a history on him as well. He had many DRUG charges, including possession, using, dealing, manufacturing. There were a lot, as well as a domestic assault charge brought by Misty. This was related to an incident where he threw her on the ground, smashed her face into the floor, put his knee over her neck so she could barely breathe, and also broke her finger. Whew. And there was actually a no contact order or a restraining order of something along those lines put in place at the time of the girl's disappearance, but obviously because of the disappearance, it was modified so that they could work together and try and find their daughter. But for all of these charges, Dan was eventually sentenced to 90 years in prison. So that'll tell you just how many charges he had. They were brought in for questioning, for any information they might have, but they stormed out of their interviews. And this didn't sit well with a lot of people because people perceived that as, oh, they're guilty and they're getting defensive. Basically, they stormed out of these interviews and they said, they don't know anything, and they were just really mad about it. And look, we all know the kind of ways police are going to question, and even if you are a loving parent, they will still question you in that way. They don't have any information. They have to look at everybody who could be potentially involved. It was really just thorough police work, but they didn't like it. Now, does that mean they're guilty of something? Some people think it does. Some people think it looks so bad that they stormed out and got all defensive about whatever questions were being asked. I just don't know if that is even relevant. When you look at it from the other side, if they are 100% innocent and they don't have the best relationship with the police because they have criminal histories. They've only ever seen the police as their enemy. And if questions start pointing towards them when they know in their heart of hearts that they didn't do anything and they were fully innocent, of course that would be frustrating as an innocent party, because you know the police are wasting their time. Look somewhere else. It wasn't like I didn't have anything to do with it. That kind of way. So obviously we don't have the full answers here, but that reaction, the storming out of the interview, like that literally could be either way. They also got them to do polygraphs, and I couldn't find any information about Dan's polygraph, but for Misty's, her first one came back inconclusive and her second one, she passed it. But then also the reason the first one came back inconclusive was because she has an anxiety disorder that just kind of threw off the test a little bit. After this though, both of them were advised not to talk to the police or the media. Before we move on though, I will say Heather, Elizabeth's mother, who's also Misty's sister, she believes that Dan and Misty had something to do with the disappearance. Whether they had something to do with it or they had some knowledge on it. And to think that of your sister is pretty intense. Is it telling? I don't know, you tell me. Alright, so let's look into the investigation as the months went on, shall we? I will say that a $175,000 reward was offered to anyone who could provide any information leading to the arrest of whoever was responsible for Lyric and Elizabeth's disappearance. And $150,000 of that was raised by the community. That is just incredible. So on the 24th of June, investigators announced that 3 separate tips had come in regarding a vehicle in the area on the day of the disappearance. And this vehicle just stood out to the people in the community. Maybe it was moving around suspiciously or stopping and someone was watching people, who knows? But it was a white SUV described either like a Chevy Suburban or a Ford Bronco. And this car was parked in Arbutus Avenue in Evansdale, which actually leads to the trail that Lyric and Elizabeth's bikes were found on. And it was seen there sometime between 11:30 a.m. and 12:30 p.m. that day, which is likely when the girls were taken. A few months later then, on the 13th of November 2012, the parents of the 2 girls wrote a letter to the abductor, which honestly was very empathetic. It said things like, "We sort of imagined that you must not have had the things you needed to grow up feeling safe and loved, because only someone who hurts inside would hurt another person and their family." Another lead was at the beginning of August 2012 when the FBI released information that they were looking for a man with a white van, and they released footage of this man getting gas for his car. But this very man came forward because he saw himself on TV and was like, "Oh, that's me." And after police spoke to him, he was cleared. But on the 5th of December 2012, something huge happened in this case. This was 5 months after the girls' initial disappearance. 2 hunters in the Seven Bridges Wildlife Area, which was about 20 miles from Evansdale, came across 2 small sets of remains in the woods in a very remote location. Authorities had a pretty upsetting gut feeling about this straight away. There were only 2 missing people in that area at that time, and they were children, and these were small bodies. But of course, confirmation needed to occur, and 5 days later, it was confirmed. These were the bodies of Lyric and Elizabeth. Now, obviously, this was close enough to Evansdale, like 20 miles isn't insane, but they were transported here. And we don't know if they were transported when they were still alive or not. But it was very clear to investigators that whoever did this, they were familiar with the local area. Seven Bridges was very remote, and it just wouldn't be known to people who weren't locals. It was a place where the locals would go fishing and hunting and stuff, but it wasn't like a point of interest beyond just the locals. It was literally in the middle of nowhere. So they came up with a list of people who would have known this area well, and also a list of the sex offenders in Bremer County, which is where this was. And they interviewed over 1,000 people. The thing was, the autopsy results were never made public, so in terms of cause of death or any of those kind of details, we actually just don't know. Even Elizabeth's parents don't know how Elizabeth actually died because they can't face it. And to be honest, that is totally fair. Unfortunately, Misty and Dan, Lyric's parents, they thought the right move now was to have Lyric's body cremated. Heather, Misty's sister, thought this was absolutely insane. She was like, why would you do this? Okay, they don't have the science to figure this out right now, but science is constantly evolving. You never know what clues her body holds that could solve this in the future and actually give us some answers and some justice. But Misty was having none of it, and she had Lyric cremated. Heather did not like this, and when I say that, I mean it made her even more suspicious than she already was. She was like, what are you hiding? Curious to know your own opinions on that. Like, is she hiding something? I mean, maybe Misty and Dan had their reasons. So let's talk about some stuff here, okay? First things first, it doesn't sit right with me that the girls were snatched on that bike trail, because it was a pretty active bike trail. There, like, someone could have been walking by, cycling by, scooting by any second, and it was a double abduction. Does it not make more sense that maybe the bikes were planted there to throw people off, to mess up a timeline? Like, to abduct or harm two people at once, even if they are just little girls, the risk in that is insane. I actually think that maybe it was more likely that they were planted. And why would Elizabeth's purse and phone be on like the other side of the fence? It's like they were thrown on the other side of the fence. Why would the girls have left their bikes there and somehow ended on the other side of the fence? It doesn't make sense to me. This is definitely the area of this video where I want your opinions on things. I want to know what you think, because I just can't quite figure it out. Also, what if this was a targeted attack? When I say that, I'm thinking, could Misty or Dan have been in trouble with someone in the D or UG world where they wanted to get them right where it hurt? Who knows? But also, the girls were out cycling almost every day that summer. Maybe someone just knew the normal route they took, knew they would be out at a certain time of day, and just used that opportunity. Another thing I would like to bring to your attention, and this is something that I've seen it discussed a lot online, okay? What if two people were involved here? And what I have to say about that is, first of all, yes, it will be easier to abduct and overpower two little girls when you have two adults trying to do it. But how many people can you go up to and be like, hey, want to go abduct some kids today and do some kind of harm to them? Like, most people would rat you out immediately for saying just that, and rightly so. It would also be much harder to keep it a secret. One of them is bound to be the weaker link. And we do have to remember that this is still unsolved to this day. If there was more than one person involved, can we really believe that this wouldn't have been solved earlier? There's more DNA, there's more chance of someone blurting something out, and I don't know, it's just gonna be a lot harder to cover up. And it's been like 11 years. It is also theorized that whoever was involved with the Evansdale murders, that this was not their first time, because they've managed to get away with it for 11 years. That is saying something, as much as I don't want to give kudos to these people. But this leads us very nicely into some theories, okay? As with any unsolved murder, there are a lot of theories out there. Some of them are a bit of a stretch, others not so much. One theory I think you'll find very interesting in this case is the potential link to the Delphi murders, which I covered a while back on my channel when it was still unsolved, and now someone's been charged for that one. But we'll get to that in a minute because there are a few names that have been thrown around in this case. One name in particular is Michael Clunder. His childhood was relatively normal until the age of 15 when he violently attacked a classmate. This led to him being bounced around from one delinquent centre to another for the next year, but by the age of 17, he committed another violent assault on a co-worker, which got him 7 years in prison. For some reason, he was released after 2 of those 7 years. Don't ask me why, but then he was back out in society. Then he got a job, and then he was fired from that job. And the day he was fired, 2 3-year-old girls were taken, abducted in broad daylight from the front garden of a daycare centre. And this was in Dayton, Iowa. Luckily, they were both found later that day, almost fully unharmed. They were both alive, which is incredible, but one of them was quite injured. But they were both alive, and I honestly think they were very, very lucky to be found alive. Because we know what can happen in those dumpsters. Like Anna Walsh case, so much evidence has just disappeared into the abyss because of dumpsters being emptied and then taken away, and you just never know. And then also, what was that other case in Scotland? Corey McCaig. He walked into a dead end after a night out. It looks like he got into a dumpster to have a sleep, and the dumpsters were emptied the following morning, and he was never found. Cameras were pointing on that dead end from every angle. He didn't walk out of there. So those 2 girls, the fact that they were found alive, I really think they were so lucky. So Michael Clunder was the top suspect in this case, of course, but he fled. So that looks good. And he wasn't seen again until Christmas Eve in Houston, Texas. But this time he was caught and eventually brought back to Iowa in police custody. He later was considered a suspect in another assault case of a 21-year-old woman. And for both of these cases, the 2 3-year-old girls and the 21-year-old woman, he was found guilty and sentenced to 41 years in prison. That would have kept him away until he was 62 years old. But for some reason, he was released after only 18 years in 2011 on parole. Why? Which is going to be even more distressing when I tell you what happened next. On the 20th of May 2013, Michael Clunder abducted 2 girls in broad daylight. Again, one of them was 15 years old, her name was Kathleen, and the other was 12 years old, and her name was Desi. And they were just friends walking home from school. He managed to lure them into his car, and he took off with them and took them to a remote location. When they got there, Desi actually managed to escape and run away, but Kathleen was not so lucky. She was murdered by him and found 2 weeks later. There's a really upsetting interview with Desi where she talks about how she feels like a coward because she ran and she couldn't save her friend, which is heartbreaking. Heartbreaking. But the thing is, on the 20th of May, the day he took them and killed Kathleen, he also took his own life. He obviously knew that, okay, one of these girls got away, she knows what I look like, she knows my car, she knows where I live, I'm not going to get away with this. And he took the easy way out because he is the real coward here, not Desi. It really upsets me that she feels that way. I mean, I get it, but no. If she didn't get away, she wouldn't have survived, most likely. But all of this to say, it later came out that Michael Clunder was actually not involved in the Evansdale murders. Something to do with the fact that he wasn't even in town at that time. It's just a very strange coincidence that there were so many double abductions in broad daylight in Iowa, and these are incredibly rare and incredibly difficult to pull off. Okay, moving on to our next theory, and this is a man called Jeff Altmeyer. This is a man who was caught attempting to lure multiple children into his van in multiple locations in Iowa. At first, all I knew was it was a man in a silver car and he was offering kids $100 to get in the van and help him with something. And at one point he must have been very desperate because he did this in one town and literally less than an hour later he did it in the next town over. Jeff had tried to entice at least 19 girls into his car in 9 different counties, and with at least 2 of them he was successful in essaying them. And Jeff was a military veteran who had been honorably discharged. We've seen this before. Ooh. Okay, now let's move on to the theory I'm sure you are waiting for. This is the one about the Delphi murders and Richard Allen. As many of you know, there have been major updates in the last few months in the Delphi murders case, the case of Abby and Libby, and the whole Down the Hill saga. But there actually are a lot of similarities between that case and this case right here. In fact, when I first heard about it, it completely reminded me of the Delphi murders case. And when I realized that they were so similar, I went to check the distance between the two towns. Like, how far is it between Delphi and Evansdale? And it's about 400 miles, which for me, living in little old Ireland, that's a huge distance. But I suppose by US standards, it's like completely different. Like, this was a 6-hour drive rather than like a 26-hour drive. But in both cases, you've got two young girls abducted in broad daylight who were out enjoying nature, also in places that were known to locals but not known to anybody who didn't live there. Both happened on days where the kids weren't in school. Both states start with an I and end with an A because you have Iowa and Indiana. Both communities have DRUG problems, and both cases involved unattended children. Now, I think like this is what the internet is saying. This is like, wow, so many similarities, but most of them seem coincidental to me. And for the most part, they're circumstances that would enable a crime like this to take place. Not in school that day, left unattended, out in nature, in a place known to locals but not known to visitors. So it's not like people are flocking there, like it could be quite quiet. You know, all of these things just kind of, they just create an opportunity. So is it really that crazy that those are the things they have in common? Like, it is still, like, there are quite a few similarities. I just don't think it's significant enough to link them. But even with that said, law enforcement have even looked into this theory. Who knows, maybe now that Richard Allen has been caught and his DNA obtained, maybe they can run that with any kind of evidence they have from the Evansdale case. And who knows where that could take us. I suppose we'll see. But that's honestly as much as I have to say about that. Other than that, 2 other people have confessed over the years to the Evansdale murders, but both of them have been disproven, so there's really nothing to that. We'll never understand why people actually do that if it's not to reduce a sentence already. Anyway, not the current conversation. But that's all the information we have about this case so far. It's kind of wild that there isn't more, that we don't have more details, more stuff to put out there, but that's just the way the cookie crumbles on this one. It's coming up to 11 years now and it's still unsolved, which pains me to say, but I will also say that the Delphi case was looking pretty hopeless for a while there. So let's just take the fact that Richard Allen has been caught to give us a little bit of hope. Investigators are still working on this. They've said this will always be an active investigation until it's solved. They're not giving up on it. They said it's never going to be a cold case. They are that intent on solving it, which is unfortunately something that we see quite rarely in true crime, but not complaining here. I am so happy for them to do that. These girls, these families need justice and answers. Just a bike ride, it's so innocent. It's such a like happy thing to do as a kid, and it's all just taken away in an instant because of someone's selfishness. Thank you so much for watching this video, guys. If you enjoyed it, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already. Follow on TikTok and Instagram at katephilpott_YT. And if you're not already, go ahead and join the Patreon. It's just a teeny tiny amount every month to help support the channel and help me keep on top of these videos. And ideally, later down the line, I can post more frequently. You're absolutely not required to do this, but it does help me out a lot, and I see you and I really appreciate you. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video, which hopefully won't be too late and behind schedule. But you know what? I'm living in Spain. I'm not working 8-hour days because I'm only here for a month and I don't want the whole month to disappear with me just working the whole time. And I know a lot of you missed out on this video here, the Robert Wong case. It makes me so mad. It makes me so confused. How is it still unsolved? It shouldn't be unsolved. Go ahead and watch that one next, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye, guys.